everybody. Welcome to this second in our year of video conference series. I'd like to welcome Dr. William Tsutsui, who is president of Hendrix College in Arkansas. Dr. Tsutsui is a specialist of modern Japanese business and economic history, and he's the winner of several awards for his publications. I found out reading about him today that he originally hails from Texas, but he received his PhD from Princeton University. Now, in the Asian Studies field, we actually know him better as the Associate Dean for International Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Kansas, which is my alma mater. And when he wasn't cheering on the Jayhawks basketball team, he was serving as history professor and director for the Kansas Consortium for Teaching About Asia in KU's Center for East Asian Studies. His publications include work on banking policy in Japan and manufacturing ideology, but he's also a renowned expert on, believe it or not, Godzilla. His book, Godzilla on My Mind, 50 Years of the King of Monsters, was published in 2004, and he followed that up with the Key Issues in Asian Studies publication that our NCTA teachers are all receiving, Japanese Popular Culture and Globalization. So I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr. Tsutsui to the second year of our video conference presentations, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you now. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Brenda. Thanks, everyone, for being here this evening. It is truly a pleasure to be with you. I'm thrilled to see so many people in so many different locations. I hope you all have better weather wherever you are than we have here in central Arkansas. It finally got over freezing today, so some of the ice and snow has melted off. My goal for this evening is really to have some fun, but also to learn, hopefully, some important things about Japanese popular culture and about post-war Japanese history. So I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint now, and I hope everyone's getting that. Good. Now, the rise of Japanese popular culture on the global stage is something that has been hard to ignore for at least the past 25 years or so. The speed and breadth of this rapid ascent and global diffusion have really been remarkable. Japanese anime and manga have become favorites internationally. Japanese video games and television series claim devoted followings around the world. And sushi and ramen noodles can be found on the shelves of supermarkets across America. As one author has put it, Japanese pop culture is ubiquitous, hot, and increasingly influential. Once routinely derided as a one-dimensional power, a heavyweight in the production and export of the hard of automobiles, electronics, and other manufactured goods, but a nobody in terms of the soft of cultural products and influence, Japan now contributes not just to our material lives, but to our everyday cultural lives as well. Now, up until relatively recently, when most folks have thought about the impact of Japanese culture on Western life, the impression has been that it's mainly been an elite phenomenon. So in the late 19th century, for example, ukiyo-e, woodblock prints, famously inspired the French Impressionist painters. In the early 20th century, Japanese literary forms influenced American poets, and Japanese aesthetics fascinated architects like Frank Lloyd Wright. After World War II, big city art houses screened the highbrow works of Kurosawa, Akira, and Ozu. Western scholars, having focused for so long on Japan's sway over European and American high culture, have been caught a little off guard by the rapid rise of Japanese pop since World War II. Although academic studies have begun to appear in English on topics from Japanese hip-hop to television dramas to Pokemon, Western scholars really have yet to explore fully the factors behind Japanese popular culture's worldwide appeal. They've also yet to explain what forces in Japanese society unleash the creative energies of things like manga and anime, J-horror films, and cute character goods like Hello Kitty. Really, we've only just begun to understand what the journalist Douglas McGray once famously described as Japan's gross national cool. Now, needless to say, explaining the rise of Japanese pop culture and its increasing global appeal is much more difficult than just observing it. Why do we like Japanese products like Godzilla and Yu-Gi-Oh? Why have anime and manga attracted such huge audiences worldwide? What is it about Japan that has apparently placed it just after Hollywood in its ability to create entertainment products that have been able to transcend culture, language, geography, gender, race, and creed? Is it just marketing and business, distribution channels and licensing deals? Or might it be novelty, the fickleness of a global entertainment audience that wants something different than Disney and The Voice, but might well drift to other providers like the increasingly sought-after pop products of Korea and Bollywood at any moment? Or is there something special about Japan, about Japanese culture, about Japanese aesthetics and sensibilities, about the creativity of Japanese society, some formula that the Japanese have hit on that explains the broad global appeal of Japanese animation, films, and other products? Now, there's no way we can honestly answer complicated questions like this in a short session on a Tuesday evening, but let's take a stab at it anyway. And what I hope to do is throw out some ideas, show you a few clips, and then perhaps we can have some time at the end to discuss the issues I've raised and the insights you all have on these topics. And I think since we're really talking in many ways about why audiences overseas have responded as positively as they have to Japanese pop culture, your opinions as consumers of Japanese pop are extremely valid in our discussion tonight. So I hope we'll share that as we go on this evening. Now, the organization tonight will pretty closely mirror that of my booklet from the Association for Asian Studies that Brenda Jordan talked about earlier, Japanese Popular Culture and Globalization. This is a concise source. It's really one of the first textbooks out there on Japanese pop culture. And so I think a good way to get a very basic overview of this very large subject area. Now, before we get into it, let me just make one more point. I think it's very easy for a lot of people to dismiss popular culture as fluff, something without a lot of historical significance. But I hope you'll appreciate at the end of the day how important pop culture can be in understanding Japan. Popular culture really is serious stuff. It's big business globally. It has a message. It is widely influential, and it reflects as well as shapes social and cultural change. I think we need to acknowledge this in looking at the history of Japan, and especially for the time period after 1945. So let me just show you two alternate timelines you might use for understanding the major watersheds of Japanese history. So this would be very much the traditional view. This is a standard sort of lineup of what a history course on Japan since 1945 would look like. This is very much how I learned Japanese history after World War II. You start with August 1945, the atomic bombings, the surrender, the Constitution imposed on Japan by the American occupation, peace, and then these sort of symbolic events that followed afterwards. The Olympics, Expo 70, the oil shocks that had a major economic impact on Japan, and so forth and so on. Really heavy on political, economic, international relations type of topics. Here's what I would offer as an alternative view, as another way of looking at how we tell the story of post-war Japan. And this one really focuses on pop culture, which in many ways captures the lived experience of the people of Japan and people around the world viewing Japan since World War II in a very different but no less real way than the previous list I showed you. So here we might see the release of very influential manga and anime, things like Tetsuan Atomu, Astro Boy, the premiere of the first Godzilla movie, the Walkman is introduced, Pokemon is introduced, and so forth. While I don't ever think I'll teach a class on post-war Japan that ignores the occupation or the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty or major economic developments, I don't really think you can understand Japan over the past 70 years without including at least some consideration of pop culture and its global diffusion. And so I guess one of my messages to you is as we look at the history of Japan since World War II, we have to include that traditional view, but also this view that shows the importance of pop culture in shaping and reflecting change. Okay, so let's go back and look at history for a little bit. Now, compared to the icons of American pop culture, Mickey Mouse, Elvis, Coca-Cola, things like anime, karaoke, and edamame all seem like newcomers to the global marketplace. But the world's embrace of Japanese pop culture, at least at the start of the 21st century, did not happen overnight, or even just over the past 25 years, when Japanese creations seem to have flooded global media. Instead, the rise of Japanese pop grew from a long history of Japanese cultural ingenuity and a complex pattern of transnational interchange that brought Western ways to Japan and Japan's pop innovations to the world. So what I want to do in starting off tonight is survey the evolution of Japanese popular culture, appreciating the diversity of Japan's pop imaginary, looking at the major forms of Japanese mass entertainments that have attracted international audiences, and briefly tracing the global spread of Japanese monster movies, comic books, video games, and TV superheroes. Now, as some of you may be aware, the origins of Japanese popular culture are often traced to the Tokugawa period, the years from about 1600 to 1868. This was a time of tremendous peace in Japan. Japan had no major wars during this period. It was a time when cities grew very healthily, when there was considerable merchant wealth in those cities, where the commercial classes were doing extremely well. So there were people with cash in their pockets to spend on leisure activities and entertainment. And it was also time with a warrior class, the samurai in Japan, who were pretty much underemployed. And they also had a high demand for entertainment. So it was a time that really gave rise to a very vibrant popular culture. This was reflected in forms like popular fiction. There are a number of Japanese fiction forms, novels, stories, and so forth that developed during this time. It is very famous, of course, for its theater, kabuki theater, which is depicted here in this woodblock print, but also bunraku, the puppet theater of Japan. Woodblock prints, of course, were a major way of diffusing information. Woodblock prints were essentially pretty much advertising in the Tokugawa period. They were not high culture forms, but they were very much almost broadsheets for the general public. And this is an example of pictures of the floating world, ukiyo-e, which were pictures of the courtesan quarters of Edo, what is now Tokyo. In 1854, of course, as I hope you've all studied, Japan was opened to the West. There's Commodore Perry arriving in Japan. This introduced Western ways in a profusion to Japan, but also opened the gates for Japanese ways to spread to Europe and the United States. And from the very start, European and American audiences were absolutely charmed by Japanese aesthetics. The story goes that one of Japan's first exports to Europe was pottery, was porcelain, which of course Japanese craftsmen were extremely skilled at making. And when they crated this porcelain up to ship to Europe for eager European consumers, they wrapped it in old woodblock prints, those kind of prints of kabuki and ukiyo-e that we saw earlier, which again were sort of these throwaway advertising pieces at the time, more or less like we'd consider newspapers. So they wrapped up the porcelain in this, they put it in crates, they sent it to Europe, and when European artists and collectors saw the amazing graphics in Japanese woodblock prints, they were absolutely fascinated by it. It started a real vogue in Europe for Japanese art and design, something that came to be known as Japonisme. There was also a fad around Japanese tattoos. In the 19th century, this became the souvenir to have if you were a Westerner who traveled to Japan. And there are many stories of elite members of society in Europe who visited Japan in the latter part of the 19th century, and the one thing they really wanted was a famous Japanese tattoo. And the people who got these tattoos included folks like the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne in Britain, and the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne in Russia as well. Significantly, and I think as you can tell if I'm talking about tattoos being had by these aristocrats from Europe, the embrace of Japanese popular culture in the late 19th century in America and the United States was largely at the elite end. It was members of the upper classes in the United States and Europe who really came to see what was special about Japanese aesthetics and culture. So it was not a broad embrace, but really a fairly small slice of American and European society that were perceiving Japanese culture in this way. At the same time, of course, Western pop culture came to flood Japan. Western clothing and hairstyles soon became commonplace. Unfamiliar musical forms and instruments were introduced to Japan. And numerous Western customs, from team sports like baseball and rugby to imported foodways, including the eating of meat, were introduced to Japan through new government institutions like schools and the military services. And this print here, which is from the Meiji period, from the 1880s, depicts the emperor at the time, the Meiji emperor, out for a walk with his courtesans, and you will notice they are dressed very much like European aristocrats at the time. They have the hairstyles of European aristocrats, including the big bushy mustache on the emperor. And you'll note there are elements of Japaneseness here. You'll see the cherry blossoms above them, but if you look down beneath them into the background, you'll see there's a factory belching smoke there. And that's not meant to be something ugly. That's meant to be something attractive and appealing. This really shows the way in which the Japanese have come to embrace Western ways so strongly. So one thing from all this is important to keep in mind is that popular culture has been flowing back and forth between the West and Japan for about 150 years. And just as Americans and Europeans adapted the Japanese aesthetics of woodblock prints, temple gardens, and tattoos in creating new styles in art and literature, so Japanese society embraced, but also transformed, Western forms like baseball, Western food, jazz, and radio melodramas to better accord with Japanese ways. Now, there have been some breaks in this relationship. Probably the most significant one was during World War II, when Japan was at war with most of the European powers and with the United States. That flow of pop culture across the Pacific and to Europe stopped, but the interchange really picked up and, in fact, accelerated considerably after Japan's defeat in World War II in 1945. Of course, American culture really flooded in after 1945. American forces occupied Japan for almost 7 years between 1945 and 1952. And with all the American GIs and sailors that came into the country, American pop culture followed. At the same time, the Japanese entertainment industry really boomed after World War II because of a huge pent-up demand for leisure and entertainment. So the Japanese people had been through a long war, a very costly and painful war, and after that experience, come the late 1940s, they really wanted to be entertained and carried someplace else by things like movies, cartoons, and so forth. Now, by the 1950s, following the end of the occupation, the Japanese economy was growing, standards of living were improving rapidly, and the public was increasingly hungry for more and more entertainment. Japan's movie studios churned out films for the nation's mushrooming theaters. Broadcasts in the new medium of television began in 1951, featuring a lot of sumo wrestling, baseball, and imported American programs. Comic books and manga magazines proliferated, and animated films in color and widescreen format by the end of the decade attracted growing audiences. And although Japan had largely been on the receiving end of global flows of pop culture after World War II, in the 1950s, Japanese pop once again began circulating overseas, and especially to the United States on a significant scale. And this really started with monster movies. Monster movies were the first Japanese pop culture form to have a major pop impact globally. So in 1954, Toho Studios released Gojira, known in this country as Godzilla, the somber story of a deep-sea creature mutated by American H-bomb testing that proceeds to attack and devastate Tokyo. I could talk all evening about Godzilla. I could keep you here overnight, but I won't. Don't worry. That'll just be part of my comments. Godzilla had very complex roots. It was inspired by Hollywood films. So it was inspired by the 1933 classic King Kong. It was inspired by films coming out after World War II, like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, that has a big brontosaurus attack New York City. It was also, though, very much inspired by Cold War tensions, by hydrogen bomb testing in the Pacific, and Japan's fears of being caught in the middle between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So the original Godzilla film was made in 1954. It was subsequently then edited and released in 1956 as the film Godzilla, King of the Monsters. And one of the interesting things about this was, in order to make the film palatable for an American audience, the Hollywood distributors hired a low-budget actor, someone who the older members of the audience will know as Raymond Burr, and he was inserted into this film. A lot of the original was edited out, and that was then released in the United States. Subsequently, that American re-edit of the original Japanese Godzilla film was subtitled in Japanese and released in Japan. And so the story of the origins of this film series are very complicated. Japanese film, edited for American release with Raymond Burr put in, re-released with subtitles in Japan. What I'm going to show you now is the trailer for the re-release of that American edit of Godzilla, which came out in Japan in 1956. And it really is a nice sort of museum piece to look at that early Godzilla movie. So, Brandon, do you want to hit video one? Godzilla was a very popular movie. It had record ticket sales in Japan. It did well when it was edited and re-released in the United States. And it really generated a whole genre of films, of Japanese monster movies. Japanese studios created a whole sort of pantheon of monsters to put on silver screens around the world. Altogether, there were 28 Godzilla films made between 1954 and 2004 in Japan. There have, of course, been 2 American films subsequently made, one quite a while ago in 1998, and then one, of course, last May, the Legendary Pictures release, which did very well internationally. Godzilla didn't just spawn imitators in Hollywood, but in fact spawned monsters internationally, with giant reptile pictures imitating the success of the Godzilla series from studios in Britain. There was a movie named Gorgo made in 1960. In Denmark, there was a film named Reptilicus from 1962, and in South Korea with Yongari in 1967. Perhaps the most famous Godzilla knockoff, though, was made in, of all places, North Korea. It turns out that the bouffanted, jumpsuited leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, was one of the world's foremost movie buffs. He is said to have had the largest video library outside Southern California when he died. And he was, it seems, a particular fan of giant monster movies. And so, of course, if you're a crazy megalomaniacal dictator in North Korea, what are you going to do if you like monster movies? Well, of course, you're going to make one of your own. And when he decided to make his own monster movie, the first thing he did was he kidnapped his favorite director from South Korea to help him make this movie. And he hired the guy in the rubber suit from Japan, the guy who played Godzilla in the Japanese films, to star as his monster. And what he came out with was this classic 1985 howler called Pulgasari. And Pulgasari is sort of a communist morality play. It's about this odd half-dinosaur, half-bull monster that loves nothing more than killing exploitative aristocrats and rescuing, liberating downtrodden peasants. It really is hilarious to watch and a very unlikely spawn of Godzilla. So just as Godzilla flowed from the Japanese marketplace internationally, going first to the United States and then circulating globally, so Japanese animation entered foreign markets. Anime, like monster movies, grew out of Western models, but soon developed into a distinctive, highly creative form. The first animated films seem to have reached Japan from Europe around the turn of the 20th century, and Japanese animators began to experiment with their own shorts about a decade later. The form matured during World War II, when animation was used to make propaganda films. After the defeat, a company called Toei pioneered the production of feature-length films, like Tale of the White Serpent, many of which were subsequently released in America and overseas. Now, as I think you can see from this illustration, the aesthetic of Toei's early animation was heavily influenced by the work of Walt Disney. So it featured a lot of cute animal characters, singing, and storylines based on familiar folk tales. Japan's most celebrated animator, who was named Tezuka Osamu, was also an admirer of Disney. He created the series Tetsuan Atomu, a Pinocchio-like story of a robotic child constructed by an elderly scientist, which premiered on Japanese TV in 1963, and as Astro Boy came to the United States the same year. Through the 1960s, as Japanese animation grew to serve the booming domestic TV market, and as the success of Astro Boy drove overseas demand, more and more Japanese animated series began to reach American and global audiences. With anime like Mach Go Go Go, which most of us, I think, know as Speed Racer, television viewers worldwide were introduced to a wide range of Japanese superheroes, crime-fighting robots, and adventuresome race car drivers. By the 1970s, Japan's dramatic post-war economic growth had elevated it to the ranks of the world's leading industrial nations. So through the 50s, Japan was quite a poor place, but the economy grew rapidly in the 1960s, and by the 70s, Japan was really hitting its stride. Japan at that time gained a reputation for producing high-quality, affordable entertainment hardware. It started with the transistor radio, but then progressed to things like video cassette recorders and the Sony Walkman. but the soft of Japanese popular culture. So when you talk about things like transistor radios and the Walkman, we're talking about hardware. The soft of Japanese pop culture was also gaining wider acceptance. In 1963, for example, Sakamoto Kyu's song Sukiyaki topped the Billboard charts in the United States, the only Japanese language song ever to do so. Sushi, which was introduced to America in the 1950s, but which was slow to catch on with mainstream diners, gradually became more fashionable. And an important innovation was the invention of the California roll, a distinctive American take on Japanese cuisine, which seems to have occurred at a Los Angeles restaurant in the mid-1970s. American diners were loath to eat raw fish, but the sort of toned-down, Americanized version of the California roll, which is sort of like as chop suey was to Chinese food, so the California roll was to sushi, was an important advance. Another important development was the introduction of Hello Kitty, first developed in Japan in 1974, but soon sold worldwide. And the story behind Hello Kitty is an interesting one. You might have studied it already. The company that created Hello Kitty is named Sanrio. And the name of the company is taken from the owner's two favorite cities in the world, San Francisco and Rio de Janeiro. And his company made little trinkets, things like lunch boxes and cheap children's pen sets and barrettes for girls' hair in Japan from the 1960s on. And one of the contracts they had was to make Snoopy branded products. So they made Snoopy lunch boxes and thermoses and so forth. But the person that founded the company really resented the fact that for every Snoopy lunchbox he sold, he had to send a royalty check back to the United States to Snoopy's creator. So he had his designers create for him a number of other animal characters, of which the most successful became the mouthless cat, or we're told now she's a human, the mouthless being known as Hello Kitty. Now, Japan's rising stature as a supplier of youth entertainment products was enhanced in the late 1970s with the start of the worldwide video game craze. Although video games originated in scientific labs in the United States and Britain, Japanese innovations came to drive the industry's growth. This is one I grew up with and was an important early Japanese game that really captured attention worldwide. Space Invaders, developed by Taito, a Japanese firm which began as a distributor of vending machines. Japanese hardware really came to dominate the video game arcades, which sprouted in American malls and campus student centers, places where I spent a lot of time when I was growing up, with games like Pac-Man, launched by Namco in 1980, and Nintendo's Mario Brothers. The Nintendo Entertainment System, a home video game console released in 1985, was based on something called the Magnavox Odyssey, and was instrumental in moving video games from arcades into the homes of players. So Japan really was a huge innovator in developing the video game industry. The 1980s then witnessed the beginnings of an explosion in the global popularity of Japanese pop. And this boom was driven at least in part by the burgeoning entertainment industry in Japan. Japanese people were growing wealthier, they had more leisure time, so they had more to spend on pop culture. Fan communities were also important in this spreading global popularity. Groups of dedicated admirers of anime, for instance, were indispensable in bringing the latest creations of Japanese cartoonists to international audiences. The 1980s, in fact, were considered by many to have been the golden age of Japanese animation, which had grown far more sophisticated, challenging, and diverse than those early Disney-inspired cartoons we talked about earlier. Viewers were drawn in by complex science fiction stories like Space Battleship Yamato, broadcast in the United States as Star Blazers, action narratives that explored the boundaries between the human and the machine. One of the most well-known here is Mobile Suit Gundam. The magical fantasies of Miyazaki Hayao, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, And, of course, the many dark visions of a post-apocalyptic world, of which one of the most famous and most striking was a 1998 feature film called Akira. Manga, a form with even a longer history and richer diversity in Japan than anime, also began to catch on abroad in the 1980s. And this is from the comic book version of Akira as opposed to the animated movie. Hampered by the challenges of translation, as well as this lingering stereotype in the West that comic books were just an entertainment form for kids, manga was only belatedly appreciated globally as imaginative, graphically refined, and incredibly varied. And as it turned out, one of the audiences that first responded and responded most enthusiastically to Japanese comics were female readers. And an important landmark in this was the release of the Sailor Moon series in the late 1980s, which really propelled manga's rising popularity worldwide. So, by the dawn of the new millennium, Japanese popular culture had entered the mainstream in America and through much of the world. Media franchises like Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, which included video games, trading cards, animated feature films, and toys, among other things, saturated global markets and created ubiquitous pop icons. Anime became a fixture on American television and began to earn respect as a real art form, notably when Miyazaki's Spirited Away won an Academy Award. Japanese live-action television, which had long been exported to Asia and other parts of the world, finally began to be more widely distributed in the United States. Following in the wake of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, based on a Japanese superhero series from the mid-1990s, Japanese programming such as Iron Chef became cult favorites internationally. And manga became one of the 21st century's first publishing sensations, as sales of Japanese comics in the United States soared in the first part of the 21st century. Interest in Japanese sports also surged, as stars like Yu Darvish excelled in Major League Baseball, and foreign talent, such as the Hawaiian-born sumo wrestler Akebono, whose birth name was Chad Rowan, rose to the highest levels achievement in the sport of sumo. So today, needless to say, Japanese popular culture seems to be everywhere, in the United States, around the world. Just as Japan was the first non-Western country to industrialize, so its popular culture has been the first from outside the Western world to gain global popularity. And we'll talk in a few minutes about why this might have been the case, but for now, I just really want you to appreciate the range of Japanese pop forms that have been embraced internationally, and the fact that this is not at all a recent phenomenon, but one that has significant historical roots. We have been consuming Japanese pop culture in America and globally for a very, very long time. So in my book on Japanese pop culture and globalization, I talk about four major themes that I see as characterizing Japanese pop. And this is pretty hard because Japanese pop culture is incredibly diverse, running the whole gamut from horror movies and monster movies to video games and animation, among other things. But I gave it a shot in here. I encourage you to look at the book for more detail. Just as a thumbnail, what I listed here is four central themes in Japanese pop culture are a fascination with apocalypse, with the end of the world, with devastation and destruction. We certainly see this in movies like Godzilla, but also in anime and manga. There's an obsession with monsters running the gamut again from Godzilla, this huge dinosaur irradiated and transformed, down to things like Pokemon. And of course, some would say even Hello Kitty has a monstrous edge to her. The aesthetic of cute is something that a lot of people have commented on Japan. Kawaii, this really sort of sticky, sweet, excessive, childish cuteness that characterized so many Japanese pop forms. And Hello Kitty is generally held up as the avatar of that. And then finally, something here I refer to as mecha, this fascination with robots and the fusion of the human and the machine. Something very distinctive about Japan, but something that has had global impact and resonated around the world. Now, seeing all these themes and the riotous profusion of pop culture they've enlivened, it's hard not to wonder, what forces in Japan, what forces in Japanese history, what forces in the contemporary Japanese experience have stimulated the broad diversity and sparked the imaginative energy of Japan's pop universe? So let's talk about that next. How did this happen? There have really been three major interpretations of where the diversity and dynamism of Japanese pop culture come from. When talking about Japan, people almost always start with culture and start with tradition, and it's no different with pop culture. When we talk about what makes Japanese pop so distinctive and so special, many emphasize the impact of Japanese tradition. Japan's long and unique cultural heritage, many folks have argued, is at the root of anime and manga, TV superheroes, and character goods. Thus, aspects of Japan's deep traditions in artistic expression, folklore, and social life, an aesthetic of simplicity, a sensibility of play, a rich imagination of monstrous beings, just to name a few, are said to have shaped and spurred the evolution of cool Japan as a global phenomenon. So, just to give a couple examples of this, people have pointed at the Japanese writing system as being very significant in helping us understand why graphic forms like cartoons and comic books have been so significant in Japan. Because the characters that go into the writing of Japanese in many ways seem like little pictures. Scholars have argued the Japanese have a better eye and a better sensitivity to graphic concepts than we might in the West, where our alphabet is much simpler and based on sounds rather than ideas or images. There also seem to be a lot of artistic forms in Japan that seem to be predecessors of manga and my book, and there are a lot of other sources out there that talk about historical forms like these sort of satirical texts from the 18th century in Japan, where we see sort of the early imagination that gave rise to manga and anime rising, this combination of drawn pictures and text together being sort of an early form of cartooning. And then, as I mentioned, there is this very, very long history in Japan of folklore surrounding monsters. And there's incredible creativity that the Japanese have for explaining things in a supernatural way, the phenomenon of the natural world and human behavior. Japanese have often turned to what are called yokai, or strange creatures, to explain things that they don't have the scientific knowledge to make sense of. So there's clearly something in the argument that there are deep cultural roots to Japanese pop, but it can't explain everything about where this creativity came from. Because not least, as we've discussed, so much of the creativity of Japanese pop culture was very much inspired by Western models. So let me give you another approach to understanding where the creativity of Japanese popular culture came from. This is also rooted in history, but it's rooted in a much more recent history, specifically the Japanese experience of war, the atomic bombings, defeat, and post-war domination by the United States. And in recent years, the most outspoken advocate of the view that Japan's pop culture imagination was fueled by the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has been the well-known pop artist Murakami Takashi. Now, in Murakami's opinion, the Japanese people never fully came to terms with defeat in World War II, occupation by the United States, and a pattern of post-war subservience to America that left the Japanese people somehow deformed and perpetually infantilized. Frank discussion of World War II, of the atomic bombings, of Japan's relationship with the United States were really pretty much off the table in post-war Japan. Those weren't subjects that were allowed in polite conversation. They were difficult subjects, they were touchy subjects, so mainstream society just ignored them. Murakami argues that since people couldn't really explore those subjects in the mainstream, it became the province of popular culture to explore these deeply repressed traumas and anxieties in the Japanese national culture and the Japanese experience. And in particular, popular culture became an important means for Japanese playing out the trauma and the fear of atomic warfare and the unresolved tensions of the post-war period. Thus, in popular cinema, manga, anime, video games, and in art, we see this compulsive reiteration of apocalypse, nuclear mutation, grotesque metamorphosis, technological escapism, social vulnerability, and other themes and imagery through which post-war Japanese have struggled to find some sort of closure for war, surrender, and ongoing dependence on America. So essentially, Murakami is saying the Japanese people were really traumatized by the war, by defeat, by the atomic bombings, and then by being dependent on America afterwards. They've never really been able to digest that, and it has just exploded forth in this creativity of popular culture in which the creators are trying to really play out these traumas and anxieties, explore these sort of hidden, repressed areas of emotion in Japan, and that's why we see the patterns in Japanese pop that we do. Two imaginative outcomes of this struggle sort of in the Japanese psyche have particularly fascinated Murakami. The first is the sense that the Japanese really have been rendered monstrous by the A-bomb's defeat and post-war acquiescence to American dominance. We are deformed monsters, Murakami writes, less than human in the eyes of the humans of the West. Okay? So he sees the Japanese as really embracing this sense of deformity that comes out of that scarring experience of defeat and atomic attack, and sees the prevalence of monsters in Japan from Godzilla to Pokemon as a reflection of this profound sense of deformity at the core of the nation's post-war identity. Murakami's other observation is that in the wake of World War II, Japan regarded itself and came to be regarded by the world as a child. Murakami wrote, "For the past 60 years, Japan has been a testing ground for an American-style capitalist economy, protected in a greenhouse, nurtured and bloated to the point of explosion. The results are so bizarre, they're perfect. We Japanese are truly, deeply pampered children. And as pampered children, we throw constant tantrums while enthralled by our own cuteness." So Japan has been infantilized in the sense it has been completely dependent on America after 1945, economically, politically, and international relations. But at the same time, Murakami argues, the Japanese people have embraced childishness, withdrawing from reality to seek refuge in juvenile fantasies. So this, he would argue, is why Japanese pop culture has not just been filled with monsters like Godzilla, but also with this abundance of cuteness, the kawaii style that symbolizes Japan's ongoing subservience to the United States, as well as its desire to withdraw into a world of youthful, irresponsible innocence. Now, like many scholars, I have a lot of problems with Murakami's analysis. It's a very sophisticated argument about where the roots of Japan's creativity in pop culture come from. But one really can't deny the fixation with apocalypse and that the fascination with monsters and childish cuteness in contemporary Japanese pop is striking. Murakami is clearly onto something. And even though I think in some ways it's very simplistic to say, oh, it all goes back to the A-bombs. It all goes back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Once you actually start looking and scratching the surface in Japanese popular culture, you'll see that the echoes of the atomic bombings seem to be almost everywhere, even in some very unlikely Japanese pop venues. So what I'd like to do now is, if we can get the video to work, to try video number 2. And let me set it up and then I'll switch over here. This is from an animated movie called My Neighbor Totoro. I expect a lot of you have seen this. It was by Miyazaki Hayao. It came out in 1988. Totoro is sort of this big, furry, blobby, fantastical folk creature who inhabits a mountain. He is a spirit who lives in this mountain. And the clip we're going to see, just to set it up briefly, the story is about 2 young girls whose mother has tuberculosis and is in the hospital, and who have gone to live with their father in the countryside. And the 2 young girls in the countryside have met Totoro, who is this fantastical creature who only they can see, who lives in the mountain next to their house. And they proceed to have a series of adventures with this creature. It is really a marvelous movie. If you haven't seen it, it is probably one of the great movies ever made about childhood and the magic of childhood and the imagination of childhood. But as you watch it, think about Murakami and his arguments about Japanese pop and where that creativity comes from, and especially think about the atomic bombings. So let's see if we can make this run. Yeah, so what a wonderful scene this is, and what a weird scene this is too, right? Where you have the 2 young girls who plant these acorns. They see this mythological creature coming out in the middle of the night. They dance around the garden, and they pull out this huge tree, which ends up being a mushroom cloud. Okay? And so, when you're thinking, it's too simple to say it all goes back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, here in probably the least likely place imaginable, a children's story, we see the mushroom cloud coming out and being a weird sheltering presence, right? It sort of sits over the house. At the end, we see the children and the Totoro almost praying to it. Don't know quite what to make out of it, but it clearly is something we have to pay attention to. Okay, so we talked about 2 explanations then for where the creativity of Japanese pop comes from Japanese culture and Japanese tradition. Essentially, that's the first. The second would be from the traumas of defeat, the atomic bombings, and dependence on the United States. The third common interpretation for the creativity of Japanese pop culture is, like Murakami's, rooted in unresolved tensions deep in Japanese society. But instead of pinning everything on war and defeat, these scholars who stress this argument point to the longer-term anxieties generated in Japan by industrialization and by modernization, by the intense, and some would say uniquely intense, pressures of everyday life in Japan. So, for instance, Japan's rapid modernization from the late 19th century through the post-war era of high economic growth has been cited as one potential source of the creative energies behind Japanese pop. The sweeping changes that modernization and modern life brought to Japan, from railroads to compulsory education to labor unions and air pollution, may have sparked the anxious energy that has made Japanese mass entertainment so dynamic and so vibrant. And the widespread fascination with science in Japan that accompanied modernization, which has been a very strong element, of course, in Japanese education, business, and government policy, may have helped give birth to Japanese pop culture's fascination with mecha and with the transformative power of technology. Other commentators have suggested that the vitality of Japanese popular culture can be seen as a reaction to the generally restrictive and limiting nature of Japan's modern society and its institutions. A highly competitive education system that does not reward independent thought or initiative, a straight-laced hierarchical corporate world built on conformity, tradition-bound family and gender systems that limit options for women and restrict personal freedoms, and a collectivist social ethic intolerant of unorthodox thinkers and individualistic free thinkers. In other words, Japanese society is so buttoned down, so controlled, so programmed in many ways, that the creativity of pop culture is the imaginative response to this kind of restrictiveness. And this social stress in Japan is often said to weigh most heavily on Japanese youth, who constitute that major market for pop products like anime and character goods. And so in this context, pop culture is a kind of release valve on the pressure cooker of contemporary Japanese life. They allow people to have ways of reinventing and reimagining themselves out of the rat race. And just for example of the rat race, this illustration here shows proper behavior patterns of how deeply you should bow based on the formality of the situation. And this is just how programmed and controlled Japanese society is. Pop culture, folks have argued, is a reaction to this. So in conclusion, as we look at these different theories interpreting where the creativity for Japanese popular culture comes from, I think it's impossible to pin it down and say it's just one. It's not just the A-bombs, it's not just Japanese tradition, it's just not the nature of contemporary Japanese society, but it is very likely a combination of all these three, and perhaps more that we haven't fully explored yet, working together. Okay, so let's move on then to the last topic I'll probably have time to get to tonight. If we have a sense now of where this imaginative energy of Japanese pop came from, let's try and understand why audiences around the world have responded to it so positively. Why, in short, do we love anime and manga, J-horror and Japanese fashion, Hello Kitty and Mothra? So there are a number of different approaches, and let me just run through them very quickly. The first approach stresses high quality and innovation. This is really one of the first explanations put forward by scholars to explain why Japanese entertainment products became so popular in the early 21st century. A good example of this is a book published in 2000, edited by Tim Craig, called Japan Pop. Craig explored a number of reasons why Western audiences respond to Japanese popular culture. He was quick to admit that not all Japanese pop culture products are necessarily of terribly high standards, but he really said, we like Japanese pop because it is so high quality and it's so innovative. It's good and it's different. Okay? Engaging visuals, high production values, obvious creativity that shine through so many of Japan's cultural exports have been really big draws for international audiences. And perhaps above all, the sophisticated graphic qualities of Japanese pop, which many observers have argued elevate Japanese products like manga to an art form, have excited and enchanted global consumers. And this is really what set Japanese pop culture apart. It's just so good. So that's one approach. The second one really grew out of that. And this is an approach that was explained very well in one of the most noted scholarly books on Japanese animation by a literary scholar named Susan Napier called Anime. And in her book, Napier argues that what makes Japanese popular culture so attractive in the West is difference and sophistication. He writes, one salient aspect of anime is its insistent difference from American popular culture. What is perhaps most striking about anime compared to other imported media that have been modified for the American market is the lack of compromise in making these narratives palatable. The medium is both different in a way that is appealing to a Western audience satiated on the predictabilities of American popular culture, and also remarkably approachable in its universal themes and images. Thus, Napier argues anime, like so much of contemporary Japanese pop, is appealing to global audiences because of its subversiveness. Its reluctance to embrace the Hollywood happy ending that assures audiences all is well with the world. Indeed, anime often leaves you with the abiding impression that the world is impossibly screwed up. And to many jaded entertainment consumers in a global market weaned on sunny Hollywood products, such a message is a welcome relief from the predictable narratives of the Magic Kingdom, Steven Spielberg, and others. So essentially, what Napier is saying is, we like anime because, boy, it is high quality, it is sophisticated, but it's so different. It's not what we expect. We've become bored with what Hollywood has to offer us in so many ways, and Japanese pop culture is different and fun. Now, another approach that I would stress, and this is one that is very appealing to me because I am a historian and I started my life as an economic historian, is to take a historical and economic approach to why Japanese pop culture is appreciated abroad. This really goes back to what we've discussed at some length, this long-term relationship between Japan and the United States, this exchange of pop culture across the Pacific. Americans really have had a long history of appreciating Japanese pop, of consuming Japanese pop. Whether we realize it or not, all of us in this country grew up in one way or another exposed to Japanese popular culture, whether it was Speed Racer, whether it was Godzilla, whether it was another form. Japan became a part of the American pop culture landscape after World War II, almost without any of us noticing it. And its familiarity prepared us, even if only subconsciously, for the waves of Japanese entertainment products that arrived in the United States from the 1980s on. So simply that pattern of being exposed for so many years to Japanese pop really conditioned us to consume it. We also need, in this regard, to appreciate the importance of economics in understanding the spread of Japanese pop products in America. So if we look back at the post-war period, and especially since the rise of television, and then again since the rise of cable TV, we see that in the United States, the media industry has just about consistently needed cheap products of relatively high quality to fill airtime. For all the TV and films being generated in Hollywood, the American demand for entertainment products has been so consistent and so strong that we have needed to import product to put up on the TV screen and put up on the movie screen. And for many decades, Japanese movies and television programs, live action and animated, have easily fit that bill. So back in the 50s and 60s, Godzilla and other Japanese monster films played this role. U.S. movie theaters needed a stream of new films, a demand which even Hollywood couldn't meet. So Godzilla, Mothra, and these other creatures were a familiar genre. Giant monster movies were very inexpensive to purchase from Japanese studios and could easily be transformed into an acceptable American entertainment product with only a small monetary investment in editing and dubbing. So Japanese sci-fi became a staple of C-list American theaters, things like drive-ins, small-town Saturday double bills, and so forth, and then became fodder for late-night television and undesirable weekend time slots. I, for example, grew up watching Saturday afternoon television creature double features, where two Japanese monster movies or a movie like Dracula, Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon played on Saturday afternoons when kids were watching. Japanese animation tracked a similar trajectory in the American television market. From the 1960s, anime imports were readily embraced by American TV programmers who needed affordable but appealing material to fill early morning, after school, and Saturday time slots that catered to youth viewers. At the same time, American producers started outsourcing animation products to Japanese studios. And classics like the beloved stop-motion Christmas special, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, as well as numerous cartoon series, including My Little Pony in the 1980s, were all made in Japan. The boom in American cable television in the late 1980s and 1990s, when dozens of new channels needed fresh content, provided another opportunity for anime in the United States marketplace, especially on venues like the Cartoon Network, founded in 1992, and for Japanese live-action programs like the breakthrough hit Iron Chef. Okay. So, economics, the history of exposure to Japanese pop culture products, those, in my opinion, were also really important in driving why we have responded so positively to Japanese pop over the past few decades. The fourth approach to understanding why we like what Japan has to offer is what I call the smell approach. And this brings us to really one of the most interesting scholars internationally working on Japanese pop culture today, someone named Iwabuchi Koichi, who's from Japan but now teaches in Australia. Iwabuchi's written a lot of essays and several books about Japanese pop culture products in an international context, and they largely focus on how Japanese pop has been consumed in other parts of Asia, in places like China and Taiwan and Korea. Iwabuchi's most intriguing notion regards the smell of pop culture products. As Iwabuchi analyzes it, all cultural products, movies, cartoons, advertising symbols, you name it, have some sort of odor, a smell about them that reflects the culture and society in which they were made. Okay? So many American products, Iwabuchi tells us, have a good odor, a fragrance, because they are associated with positive attributes of the American lifestyle and the American dream. Thus, Hollywood movies have been popular internationally because their fragrance carries with them envious yearnings for American wealth, freedom, democracy, leisure, and coolness. Okay? So when international audiences watch a Hollywood Western, they've gotten this good smell, this fragrance, because it reminds them, it calls forth so many positive images of America. But Japan, Iwabuchi argues, doesn't have this kind of pleasant scent in the nose of the world's pop consumers. Indeed, pop culture products that make people think too readily of their Japanese origins are likely to have a bad odor, he says, a stink, if you will, that comes from negative preconceptions of Japan, based on notions of race and inferiority among Western audiences. So Western audiences, he argues, have sort of stereotypes about Japan that are negative. And in Asia, in other parts of Asia other than Japan, he argues, it's that lingering history of Japanese imperialism and colonialism that give them a bad odor. That because Koreans, for example, or Chinese remember that bad experience with Japan in the early part of the 20th century, they have a negative reaction to Japanese pop culture products. Iwabuchi argues that the only Japanese pop products that have hit it big globally were those that are culturally odorless. That is to say, that are slick and sophisticated and creative and well marketed, but which do not smell too much of Japan to people overseas. And to Iwabuchi, these odorless products, which are called by other scholars mukokuseki, which is a Japanese word that means lacking in a sense of national origin, these odorless mukokuseki products are the 3 C's. Consumer technologies like VCRs, karaoke, the Walkman, comics and cartoons, that is to say, manga and anime, and finally, computer and video games. And what Iwabuchi goes on to argue is that Japanese goods ultimately can only be successful internationally if they are scrupulously scrubbed clean of cultural association with Japan and presented as a kind of placeless, historyless, cultureless, odorless entertainment commodity. So Iwabuchi suggests anime has only made it big because somehow it doesn't seem very Japanese, despite its Japanese origins. Now, Iwabuchi's ideas are interesting, they're provocative, they're quite controversial. I think his approach really helps us explain some things, like the popularity of Hello Kitty, which generally has been pretty difficult for scholars to get a handle on, but which is a perfect, I think, odorless commodity. There is nothing inherently about this weird mouthless cat that suggests it's somehow Japanese. This is really a purely Mukokuseki product on some level. That could have come as easily from the United States as from Japan. Now I think most of us realize Hello Kitty is Japanese, but its popularity was built on not having that Japanese odor. The same might be said of Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. But I remain somewhat skeptical of Iwabuchi's notions of smell, as I really wonder just how Mukokuseki and odorless something like anime is. Even if, as we all know, so many of the characters in Japanese animation don't look terribly Japanese. This is an issue that a lot of scholars have wrestled with. Why do the people in Japanese animation and manga not typically look like what we consider to be Japanese? Big round eyes, light skin, blonde, pink, blue, purple hair, you name it. But these reservations aside, I do think Iwabuchi's ideas are worthy of consideration. So, there's much more I could talk about. This is a very complicated picture of why we like Japanese popular culture. And one of the things in our discussion period is I'm really interested in hearing from you why you like Japanese popular culture, what appeals about it, why growing up you found it particularly resonant with your concerns and interests. And also from that experience, how you'd go back now with this historical and academic background on Japanese popular culture and hopefully understand better where it came from and why it has found such global popularity. One of the important things to keep in mind is we haven't figured it out on Japanese pop yet. There is still a tremendous amount of research to do. And I want to encourage all the students out there in particular that in terms of doing research, in terms of exploring Japan, pop culture is a very, very fertile field in which you can use some of your personal passions to learn more about Japanese culture, the economy, politics, and society more broadly.